Hi everybody, thanks for joining me today to talk to you about biodiversity net gain. Um, the presentation will include an overview of what biodiversity net gain is, and then how it works, and after that some kind of opportunities and constraints that we're finding or predicting. There's been some updates recently, so the government released its consultation response last week or the week before, so we've been having a good read through that, and there's been some extra guidance in that, so I've tried to include that in the presentation today for you. Still lots of questions though, and yeah, I'm happy to take any of your questions at the end of the presentation. But firstly, this is just to introduce our team. It's Native Ecology. We are based in Kent near Whitstable. There's 8 of us in our core team, but we kind of contract in the winter, and then we have lots of seasonal subcontractors. In the summer, we are all gearing up to be ready for biodiversity net gain. We've been training for about 5 years now, and sort of speaking to developers and telling them it's going to come in, it's going to come in. Unfortunately, COVID put the implementation period back by a couple of years, so it has been a long time coming. But I'll talk to you about the kind of new deadlines that there are in place now. We do work with a number of specialists as well, botany specialists, which is going to be really important for biodiversity net gain, invertebrates and bird specialists. So that's our team there. So what is biodiversity net gain? You might have heard lots of people kind of make this quote. So biodiversity net gain is an approach to development that leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state than before the development took place. Measurably being the important word there. It is additional to existing protected species and sites. So we, as ecologists, still need to undertake preliminary ecological appraisals. We still need to do our protected species surveys and ecological impact assessments alongside net gain. The information we gather from those surveys will feed into net gain, but biodiversity net gain doesn't take away anything from the surveys that were already undertaken there. So the current position is that biodiversity net gain was mandated through the Environment Bill, which gained royal assent in November 2021. We've been and still are in a 2-year transition period, with biodiversity net gain becoming mandatory in November 2023. So the government have announced that that is definitely going to happen now. It's been, at least 5 years coming, but we have a date for when it's going to be mandated now. There's been, like I said, the recent release of government consultation response, which has gone some way to answer some of the many questions that all sorts of different industries have about how biodiversity net gain is going to be implemented. So as I said, I'll come on to some of those in the presentation. And we are expecting secondary legislation soon, before November, which will set out, hopefully, most of the questions that we still have about how we're going to go about biodiversity net gain. So the Environment Act amends the Town and Country Planning Act and states that a minimum of 10% net gain is going to be required for every development, with some exceptions, which I'll come on to later. The habitat that's created or enhanced has to be secured for at least 30 years. So that's a big commitment there. And it will be secured with planning obligations and a legal agreement called a conservation covenant. Biodiversity net gain can be delivered on-site, off-site, or it can be through statutory biodiversity credit scheme, which I'll come on to a bit more later. And the Environment Act also states that there's going to be a national register where all biodiversity net gain sites will be registered, and that register will be open to the public and public scrutiny. So this is just an overview of what biodiversity net gain is, how we as ecologists calculate it and assess it in relation to development projects. So it's all about habitat features. Like I said, protected species do come into it, but only really when we're deciding about what appropriate habitats would be to enhance and create on the site. So it's a shift away from individual protected species to habitat creation, restoration, enhancement. It's based on a categorization called UKHAB, which is what we as ecologists use to map and categorize habitats. This has moved on from phase 1 habitat surveys, which you might be familiar with. Over the last sort of 5-ish years, ecologists have been moving away from phase 1 towards UKHAB, and it's that structure that the biodiversity assessment uses. It's measured in biodiversity units. So we'll come on to how we go about calculating it later in the presentation, but biodiversity units is the value that we're measuring net gain in. And we're using areas in hectares and linear measures in meters of habitats. Importantly, and again, we'll come on to this later, area habitats and linear habitats are treated totally separately, which has caused some constraints on sites that we've worked on already. So you could potentially have a minus 50% score for area habitats like grassland, woodland. And what we're finding is sites often come out as sort of plus 1,000% for hedgerows, tree lines, linear habitats. And you can't put those together. They're totally separately, so you can't just merge them together and come out with what they are added together. There are going to be some exemptions, but not many. So very small developments won't have to achieve biodiversity net gain, and that's 25 meters squared or 5 meters for linear habitats. Householder applications will be exempt, and sites where the enhancement is for biodiversity and wildlife, those will be exempt from having to undertake a biodiversity net gain assessment. Permitted development will not be required to deliver biodiversity net gain. And importantly, development sites with reserved matters will not be required to fulfill mandatory BNG if the outline was approved prior to November. So any applications going through now which receive reserved matters won't technically have to achieve biodiversity net gain, but what we're actually finding on lots of sites already over the past couple of years is that local planning authorities have been requesting biodiversity net gain on many sites. So we as ecologists have already undertaken lots of biodiversity net gain assessments, even though it's not mandatory through the Environment Bill yet, it is included within local plans. And it's those local authorities which are requesting biodiversity net gain assessments from certain developments. There are some sites that have to be excluded from a net gain assessment, and those are ones where irreplaceable habitat is going to be impacted. So that's ancient woodland is the obvious habitat here. Natural England are currently developing new advice and guidance to set a definition for irreplaceable habitats. The one we most often come across is ancient woodland, which might surround a development site. Often the ancient woodland boundary is slightly in the development site, and if it's impacted by that development, then they can't achieve biodiversity net gain. There is going to be some more guidance on, okay, well, if we can't do a biodiversity net gain assessment, what can we do on a site that impacts irreplaceable habitat? And Natural England are apparently going to release some more guidance on the kind of assessment that we would undertake for that. So when we undertake our net gain assessments, we begin by mapping the habitat baseline. So this is us mapping using UK habitat. So we have to use the specific habitat names and we have to categorize them as specific habitats. So for this example here, we've got other neutral grassland, some modified grassland, dense scrub. It's all color coded as well, so that all ecologists should be producing maps that can be understood by anyone who knows the codes and the colors. So we're all adhering to the same categories here. You can see here, there's an example of the baseline habitat here. So this is a development we worked on. The baseline habitat is mostly other neutral grassland. There's some scrub, there's a pond on site. So those habitats are relatively valuable. What we do then is we map any sort of plan that the developer has. So they might, and they have over the last few years, had their plans fully drawn up already at this point. So they've got the layout of the development, and we then categorize that into habitats. So for this, the proposed and post-development map, you can see there's lots of artificial, unvegetated, unsealed surface. There's other developed land, which in this case, I think is a car park. There's a new water body towards the north of the site, which we've categorized as a pond. And what we do then is we compare the before and after using the metric calculation. So these as well, obviously getting the mapping correct is really important. So this is all mapped in QGIS for us, so that we can get accurate areas from the mapping system. And everything is calculated in the metric, which you've probably already heard of. At the moment, we are on metric 3.1. Natural England are going to release a metric 4.0 this year. They haven't said exactly what the changes will be, but apparently they're going to be minor. So at the moment, we're still using this metric 3.1 tool. And you can see there's the on-site baseline. So we would measure and input all the baseline habitats. And then we would add in the on-site post-development, on-site enhancement, the off-site. If we are using off-site habitats, which I'll come on to later as compensation, you add all the figures in for the off-site baseline and post-development as well. And if you've got everything correct and everything works, the metric 3 will come up with a figure of what percent plus or minus the site comes out with for biodiversity net gain. So this is, the metric is not easy to use. Natural England have tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. We as ecologists have undergone specific training on how to use the metric, certain knacks that you have to use, ways around certain aspects of the metric. And obviously it's been improved upon over the last few years. So we've been working to kind of upskill our ecologists on how to use the metric and what figures to input and where, because it makes such a huge difference on the score sometimes. And that score is obviously really important to the development and how viable the development is. It does come with lots of guidance. So there's the user guide to the metric 3, and there's a technical supplement which will tell you all about how to use the metric 3, the do's and don'ts of how to use it. And those are all available on the Natural England website, government website. And so the government will also be releasing new guidance on how to use the metric 4 when it comes out later this year. So the way we calculate the habitats and input them into the metric, there are 4 aspects we need to consider. So we need to consider the size of the habitat parcel. So once we've done that map, we parcel all the habitats into the different categories, and then we measure the size of each of those parcels. And we measure those in, like I said before, in hectares, or for linear habitats like hedgerows and tree lines, we measure those in meters. So we've got, for example, say 50 parcels of habitat on a site, and each one of those parcels we have a measurement for on its size. Then we would undertake a condition assessment, and this is the part where we would have to undertake a survey. This is where we need botanists involved on a lot of sites. If it's relatively common habitats on the site, potentially you don't need a specialist botanist, but for ours, we are tending to send actual botanists onto the site to undertake the habitat condition assessment. And during this assessment, we categorise each of the parcels into poor, moderate or good condition. And that's based again on government guidance, which will tell us which indicator species to look for, whether there's habitat damage on the site, how much damage, and we put all of that information into the habitat condition assessment and come out with that score of poor, moderate or good condition. So, for example, on a parcel of land, you might have some other neutral grassland and it's 0.5 hectares in size, and we have condition assessed it as moderate condition. The distinctiveness of the habitat also carries some weighting when we're calculating the score. The metric will assign a distinctiveness to the habitat. So once you've chosen the habitat and you've clicked down and put it into the metric, it will assign it a distinctiveness. So you have habitats, for example, like modified grassland, which would be something like a sports pitch, playing fields, golf courses, things like that would be categorized as modified grassland, and they are low distinctiveness habitats. Habitats like lowland meadow would have very high distinctiveness. Woodland, depending on what type of woodland, would have high distinctiveness. And obviously those habitats then generate more biodiversity units. And then there's strategic significance. So this is about where the habitat is located. Is the habitat in an area that is of local priority, or is it located in an area that the LPA have mapped as a local priority area? If the answer is yes, then that habitat carries more weighting in the metric. If the answer is no, then obviously it has less weighting and it's going to generate less units. So this is just a snapshot really of what that would look like in the metric when calculating it. So you can see we've got, as a broad habitat type, grassland, woodland and forest, cropland, and 2 urbans there. And I've just put these in really quickly to give you a kind of overview and a comparison about what kind of habitats generate how many units and how many units we're kind of talking about. So grassland at the top there is other neutral grassland. So this would be anything above a playing field. So if it's an area of grassland that's mown, say 3 or 4 times a year, it might be quite tussocky, but it's not chalk grassland or acid grassland, would count as other neutral grassland. So this is a habitat, as ecologists, we come across a lot, and lots of development sites have other neutral grassland as a baseline habitat. I've just put 1 hectare in for all of them, even if it's not appropriate to that habitat, just so that you can see a comparison of how many units are generated. So for other neutral grassland, we often come across that in moderate condition. You can see that it's assigned a distinctiveness score of medium to that. And although it's not in the local plan, say for this site, it is ecologically desirable. So that's the kind of middle way between it is in the local plan or it's not in a strategy at all. It's still desirable because it's grassland. And all those put together at the very end, you'll see come to a baseline score of 8.8 biodiversity units. So this 1 hectare of other neutral grassland in moderate condition generates 8.8 biodiversity units. Compare that to, say, cereal crops, which will always generate a low biodiversity value in terms of units. That's the same 1 hectare, it's low distinctiveness. You can't condition assess cereal crops, so that always goes in as NA. It's not in the local strategy, and it generates only 2 biodiversity units. So you can see here that if you started on a development site with cropland, your baseline is low, and that's, as a developer, what you should be aiming for. If you start with a baseline that's generated by other neutral grassland, achieving a 10% net gain is going to be much more difficult than if you were starting on cropland. I've put a couple of drainage features in here just to give you an idea. Obviously, you're probably not going to have a hectare of rain garden, but just to give you an idea of how many biodiversity units those kind of features could generate on a site. So we've talked about the metrics so far, and that is numbers other than the sort of the condition assessment. Is number crunching, and a lot of developers we work with will just ask us to do a metric assessment to see if they get a 10% net gain or not. And that's not what biodiversity net gain is about. It's part of it for sure, and it's how we measure it. But biodiversity net gain is qualitative as well. It needs to take into account what those habitats on site are supporting, whether they are part of a corridor, a network, how important they are for local biodiversity. And this is where the good practice principles come into effect. This is guidance that was produced a few years ago by Syria, IEMA and CIWEM, and it lays out the aspects that should support the biodiversity net gain calculation. Developments that claim to achieve biodiversity net gain should, and hopefully all will, demonstrate that they have adhered to these good practice principles and that they haven't just number crunched through the metric. So to give you an idea of what some of these principles are, the first one is really important, which is apply the mitigation hierarchy. So that's avoid, mitigate and compensate. And that's the usual process that we go through when undertaking an ecological impact assessment. So the LPA will want to see that the development has first avoided any important habitats. So for example, if there was woodland on a site, you would want to avoid impacting that habitat first. And if avoidance is not possible, that there's some mitigation, and then the last resource compensation. So this should be shown on all development sites with biodiversity net gain. It should be additional. So biodiversity net gain needs to deliver above and beyond what would have been delivered anyway. It needs to deliver above and beyond any mitigation for protected species. For example, if you needed to create habitat on site to relocate reptiles to, and the habitat the reptiles require is grassland, then the developer would need to show that they've created that grassland for reptiles and then gone above and beyond what was required for reptiles to contribute towards the biodiversity net gain. And it needs to make a measurable net gain contribution. So in devising what habitats are going to be created and enhanced, we need to think about conservation priorities. So we need to then start bringing in the species that that habitat is going to support. And this is, with the principles, this is where we would look to our ecological impact assessment, our species surveys, and try and mesh those together so that we're creating habitats that are appropriate and supporting the priority species that are present in that area. Multifunctional landscapes are important, and they can be used to add to the biodiversity net gain calculation. There's been lots of questions about this over the last few years, for example, with using SUDs. Obviously, on a lot of developments, the SUDs is not it's not there for biodiversity net gain. It's a feature that would have been created whether the developer was trying to achieve net gain or not. It's going to be kind of trial it and test it to see what local authorities come back with. What we've done on a few sites we've worked on so far is we have categorized the SUDS pond as SUDS in the metric, and there is a category for that, so you can choose sustainable urban drainage system on the metric. And then what we've done is worked with the drainage engineers on the site to work out how much of the SUDS could potentially permanently hold water, and if it permanently holds water, it can be counted as a pond instead of a SUDS. And that would generate more biodiversity units than the SUDS itself. So we come up with systems potentially where, say, half of the SUDS is counted as SUDS in the metric and the other half is counted as a pond, so that we can generate as many units as possible. We do then have to show that that pond is going to be specifically also managed for wildlife as well as drainage. Public open space can be used to create habitats like meadows, orchards, community orchards, and road verges where it's appropriate, and if you can prove that you can create habitat in the long term, can also be used for biodiversity net gain. What we're finding talking to biodiversity officers at the LPA is that some schemes are squeezing in habitats that just wouldn't work. So the road verges at the entrance of a development site or a residential development, they've put as, say, lowland meadow, which is a habitat that you're never going to create in small sections throughout a residential development. So it's really important that the landscape architects, the ecologists, the drainage specialists work together to be really pragmatic about actually what habitats could be created and sustained in the long term within a residential development. The way we're working out some habitats is that we will calculate up to 0% using the habitats that would be created anyway. And then from that 0%, we're taking that and adding to it with any additional measures that we, as ecologists and landscape architects, design into the site. So this is a big one, really, the shift in development focus. And this is something that we at Native Ecology have been working on, like I said, for at least 5 years now. We've been undertaking lots of CPD with our development clients, trying to get them ready for biodiversity net gain. It's going to be a huge shift away from what developers are used to in how they design their sites, how they choose their sites, and how sites go through the planning system. So what we come across often is we will be approached by a developer, and they've been advised by the local authority to have a preliminary ecological appraisal undertaken. And this is at the point where they've already submitted their application to the local authority. It's designed, the layout is set, and what usually happens then is that they will have, probably on lots of sites, expensive and time-consuming protected species constraints. They haven't designed habitats specifically into the development. And as ecologists, we've had no influence on the design of the development. This is worst case scenario. I should say that we have lots of developers we work with who do engage us earlier in the process. But more importantly, it means that their site selection doesn't consider the biodiversity value of the site necessarily. And this is going to be a big shift when it comes to choosing sites that can be developed with regards to biodiversity net gain. It also means that the developer, in not designing the development around habitat creation, has missed opportunities to integrate people and the natural environment within that development site. So with biodiversity net gain, there is going to have to be a shift in focus. Developers are going to have to think about what the baseline value of a site is before they start to design residential developments, because it might be that they can't achieve 10% net gain on the site, and trying to achieve net gain off-site is going to be too expensive, and that the development is actually not viable on that piece of land because the baseline habitat value of that land is so high. It's also going to encourage developers to think more about accessible natural areas that linked outside of the development site to a network of green and blue corridors. So this, as I said, is something we've been working on for a while and talking to developers. Obviously, the November deadline is looming very quickly. Lots of developers we work with have been getting ready over the last few years, others not so much. We have had already quite a few clients come to us with land they're thinking about purchasing and asking us to do a baseline assessment on that, which is the ideal scenario. We can then let them know the baseline value of the site, areas that are just that they should avoid, and then that gives them a really good idea of the area left on that site that would be able to be developed, and then from there how many units could actually be delivered on that site. So this one is a case study, and it's something we get asked a lot and that we have over the last few years. And in doing some CPD to some developers, some of them have actually said, well, we'll just reduce the baseline value of the site before the ecologists get onto the site to do the condition assessment. And obviously this is something that the government and all consultees on government documents have brought up, is that what about if the baseline value of the site is degraded before an assessment is done? And this has happened, this, before biodiversity net gain was even mentioned, really, we would come across sites like this, where we're doing the PEA and it's bare ground. In the past, we would, say to a developer, well, actually, you're going to have to recreate that habitat, or the LPA are not going to look favourably at this habitat removal. But ultimately, there was no method in place to be able to really do anything about sites like this. There is now, as part of biodiversity net gain, so within the Environment Act, it is clearly stated that any habitat that was degraded since the 30th of January 2020 will have to take that earlier habitat state as the baseline for biodiversity net gain. So this means that if we come across a site like this, we would have to take the baseline from the 30th of January 2020. And obviously, if there's no, if there was no survey work done at that time, we would have to just take that from aerial images or any other information we can gather. And then importantly, we have to take a precautionary approach. So habitat types would all be classified as in good condition because we don't know what condition they were in. So this is an example we came across where a landowner had cleared an area that on a magic map was designated as traditional orchard. We had not been to the site before we saw it in this state. So based on biodiversity net gain and the rules, we took a precautionary approach and we looked at aerial images. We looked at any data we had from Natural England, which said that the traditional orchard was in good condition, and had to take the baseline as that previous habitat type. This example was quite clear-cut. It was traditional orchard. It's going to be more difficult for developers to come to terms with if it was grassland and we didn't know what habitat condition was, and we have to say that it was in good condition, and in which case the biodiversity value, precautionary biodiversity value of that site will be high as a baseline. So for this specific example, putting together the site being a traditional orchard, along with their proposed plans, came out with a figure of -78%. And the only advice we were able to give them was that they would need to recreate as much traditional orchard as possible. And using the metric, if we were to create that habitat off-site, they would need to have nearly 6 hectares of off-site land. So they've gone from 1.38 hectares of on-site traditional orchard to now having to need 5.7 hectares of off-site land to compensate. The next issue and opportunity is a cultural change. So this is changing the minds of people, individuals, communities. Natural England hosted a conference last week on biodiversity net gain, and the message throughout the conference was the need to change people's perception of what residential developments should look like and can look like. So it's a change from tidy parkland habitats to wildlife habitats, not necessarily like this example in your front garden, but in and around where people live. So since the pandemic, there's been lots of studies done about how people value nature more for their well-being. They are getting out and about more, interacting with nature more. Lots of documents about how important it is for well-being in communities. But there is still an issue as to whether people will accept those natural habitats on their doorstep. So it's one thing going to a wildlife reserve or even a public open space. It's another thing when those habitats are delivered on site in a residential area. And what it means is less mowing, it looks like less maintenance. And we have a site as an example where it's not a biodiversity net gain site. It was a habitats created for great crested newts. But we had a meeting recently with the management company who need to maintain those habitats. And they were getting lots of complaints from the residents about how messy the verges looked, and how no one was mowing the grass, and they were having to do it themselves. So it is going to take a cultural change, and it's going to take sales teams and developers and all of us really to educate and talk to communities about what natural habitats look like and what they can look like, and to manage expectations about what they look like and the difference between delivering a biodiverse habitat and a messy looking housing estate. It's going to be a move away from ornamental park planting. It's going to take landscape architects to sometimes reconsider their designs for developments. We work really closely with one landscape architect company in particular, and it's been really useful for both of us to work together on that, because they've got their objectives and we've got ours, and we just need to come together and talk about those and how we can deliver them in a way that would be maintainable. Offsite opportunities. So as I mentioned, biodiversity net gain can be delivered either on-site or off-site. The mitigation hierarchy is to deliver on-site first. And if you plug into the metric habitats delivered on-site, you will gain more biodiversity units. So in the metric, you're penalised for creating off-site habitats, which means the area of habitat you would need to create would probably need to increase, or the type of habitat distinctiveness you are creating would need to be improved if you are looking at off-site biodiversity net gain. The off-site market is going to be big. So at the moment, we've seen, and when I say off-site market, this is basically the sale of biodiversity units. So if a developer can't achieve biodiversity net gain on site, we as ecologists would say, okay, well, you need to get 10%, you need 3 biodiversity units, and those units need to be generated by grassland. The developer would then find a seller of biodiversity units and buy those units from them. So an offsite provider who's selling the biodiversity units could be the local planning authority. It could be a conservation group that it owns and manages land. There are going to be lots of brokers, middlemen working for landowners, and there's going to be private landowners like farmers coming forward with biodiversity units. The government at the moment seem to be on a push for landowners to come forward. There is a worry that come November, when developments can't achieve 10% on site, they need to buy units from somewhere. So we need this land ready, and we need the units ready to be able to facilitate those developments. There are some positives of off-site habitats being created for potentially compensation for a residential development, creating those habitats off-site outside of that residential development. It means that bigger, better, and more joined up habitats can be created. So not just snippets of road verges or open space here and there. You can create large areas of habitats that are in really strategic places, joined up habitat corridors at a landscape scale. It potentially relieves that conflict of use in public spaces. So if there is a public open space, it can be used as a football pitch or a dog walking area instead of being actively managed just for habitat creation. Potentially easier to manage. Like I said, you don't have that conflict potentially with the residential development. It's easier to manage at a large scale and potentially more financially viable to manage habitats on a larger scale. These are the habitats that are going to be added to the register that I mentioned earlier. So that register will be held by Natural England. At the moment, it's only off-site habitats that are going to be registered and available for the public to look at, find, and police, basically. There'll be a 30-year management requirement, so that landowner, if they're a farmer, for example, they've got a 30-year commitment if they're selling biodiversity units from their land. And then this market at the moment is estimated that it's going to be worth 135 to 274 million pounds annually. But there's a lot of questions about that, and we're going to have to just see where the market goes. It does, one of the big negative points is that it moves nature away from communities. So rather than people being able to enjoy, interact with nature for their well-being, rather than it being on their doorstep, it may be, far away on private land that's not accessible by people. How much a biodiversity unit costs comes up a lot, and there is no answer at the moment. Years ago, Natural England released a document which said about £9,000 to £12,000. It doesn't look like it will be that low anymore. We've seen units for sale for up to £90,000 each. It looks like they might settle around £30,000 each. They're not going to be cheap. So it's definitely in a developer's interest to find that land with the low baseline value. Another issue that's arising at the moment, and we've had in ecology and other sectors for a long time now, but it's going to be much more acute when biodiversity net gain is mandatory, is the skills gap and resourcing. So like I said, at the moment, for our more interesting sites, we have a subcontracted botanical expert. Botanists are few and far between. So they're going to be highly sought after, and botany is not something you can learn overnight. It takes a long time, and it takes learning it every day to be a good botanist. So that's going to be a big skills gap for ecologists. The GIS mapping side of it, obviously we could subcontract that out to other companies, but a lot of companies are employing specialist GIS mapping consultants now who aren't necessarily ecologists to be able to deliver this, the biodiversity net gain assessments. But this skills gap is not just in ecology, so there's going to be a skills gap in the whole of the design team. It was really interesting in the conference last week to hear from landscape architects and how they are going to have to change their outlook on how they design habitats, rather than sort of parkland ornamental landscapes. They're actually now having to think like an ecologist to create habitats. It was also interesting to listen to landscape management companies who are used to mowing often and looking after those ornamental type shrub habitats are now going to be having to look after or manage habitats for their biodiversity value. So there's upskilling required in that industry. The local authority in particular, there are lots of questions about how they're going to be under-resourced to be able to deal with all these planning applications with biodiversity net gain assessments coming in and attached to them. Are they going to have the biodiversity officers there to be able to assess these documents? So there's going to be, well, we're already seeing so much recruitment going on in all of these sectors, and there's going to need to be a lot of upskilling. We have been, like I said, looking into this for at least 5 years now, and trying to upskill all of our ecologists. But even then, we are concerned, I suppose is the right word, about what is going to happen come November when every single one of our projects is going to have to need a biodiversity net gain assessment. So from that, collaboration is key. And again, with this conference that I attended last week, that was really obvious. There were so many different sectors there, all with their different questions about biodiversity net gain, all with their own different stakeholders and interests. It's going to take everyone working together, especially on larger sites in particular, or more controversial sites, working together to find good solutions. And like I said, as ecologists, we find it really beneficial to work with landscape architects, the drainage engineers, everyone involved in the biodiversity net gain assessment. Obviously here you've got the designers, so as ecologists we kind of span both, but you've got the designers and they're drawing out plans and calculating how it's going to work, and that's just not going to work if you haven't got the habitat management companies who are able to deliver that 30-year commitment to those habitats. So there's no point in designing something that just isn't going to work on the ground. So we need the expertise from management companies working with landscape architects to make sure that the habitats proposed are actually viable for that long 30-year at least period. What next? So lots of questions still unanswered. But the government are going to be releasing secondary legislation soon, which hopefully will definitively answer some of those questions. They are also going to release more guidance documents from DEFRA. The metric 4 is coming out in the next few months, I believe, and that will be an improved version of the metric 3. We're expecting report templates, which is going to help local authorities in assessing reports that come from ecologists. So hopefully all those reports will follow a similar template and will be much easier to discern whether the calculations are correct, whether the habitats that they're proposing are feasible. So that will make it a lot easier for the local planning authority. At the moment, there are no report templates, so all ecology reports that come in must be different for the LPA to look at. The small sites metric has been delayed until next year because the LPA and the government were worried about this sort of avalanche of new planning applications that need biodiversity net gain assessment. So small sites won't be mandatory until the year after. Hopefully we've got to grips a bit more with net gain by the time the small sites metric comes in the year after. The small sites metric, I should say, is for what it says on the tin. It's for smaller sites, and the government are hoping that that can be dealt with pragmatically and much more quickly, a more simplistic version of the full biodiversity net gain. But they are working on that at the moment and don't have it ready yet, which is part of the reason for the delay there on the small sites. And that was my whistle-stop tour of biodiversity net gain. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. That was really interesting. You can imagine we had quite a few questions in. I won't be able to cover all of them. I'll just pick a few really just to see. So I think I already touched on to that, but one question is, should such features not have different subcategories, some features more biodiverse than others? I think I already started to talk a bit about it, but I don't know if there might be something that could be involved, you know, in later versions of the metric to give that further consideration.
There are a few different options for drainage systems in the metric. So basically we can only categorize it as what Natural England have decided are different habitat types or different systems in the metric. I'm not sure off the top of my head whether there are different types of SUDs in particular. I think there's just one, but there are different things like rain gardens and there are other urban drainage systems on there. They probably all have very similar weighting, to be honest. And it's only by categorizing it as an actual habitat in UK HAB, like a pond, that we can gain any more units from it. But those urban, most drainage systems, or all of them, are categorized into the urban part of the UK HAB, and that means that they don't generate a great deal of biodiversity units.
Enough. Then there is just a question, just to go back to the degradation of land beforehand. So what if a landowner degrades a habitat, then a developer purchases it? Do you know what, well, if you can answer that, but the responsibility, who does it lie with in terms of achieving the B&G?
So if the developer has already purchased it, then it is down to them. Yeah, and for them to sort out with the landowner and that what happened with regards to the degradation and if there's any compensation or anything between them. But the buck lies with the developer then. And actually, now that that is in black and white in government guidance, they would be expected to know that that's the situation they were getting themselves into. So they wouldn't be able to say, well, it wasn't me, so I don't need to do it. They would still need to do it. So it would be their problem.
There was just something mentioned as well, just in terms of multi-benefits for biodiversity net gain. So the whole offsite market seems to be an amazing opportunity, as a question now, to deliver natural flood management measures. So have you worked on any of these schemes? Obviously, we also have the whole nutrient neutrality. It's a hot topic at the moment as well. Have you worked on any of these schemes which seem to address that?
We haven't worked on any flood management schemes. We have worked on the nutrient neutrality, but that was creating woodland rather than flood wetland habitat. That is a form of stacking. The government are calling that stacking, when you use biodiversity net gain and you've got other environmental benefits at the same time. So the nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain can be stacked together, but they have to still adhere to the guidance for each of those individual options there. So you would still need to achieve 10% net gain over and above what you needed to do for nutrient neutrality. So you can stack those. Carbon credits, I've heard you won't be able to stack those, and I'm not sure the ins and outs of that. But certainly creating wetland for nutrient neutrality, especially where we are in Kent, where with the Stod Marsh and the Stour catchment, that's such a huge constraint in development now. Being able to stack that with biodiversity net gain will be really useful to landowners in accepting that and gaining more financial benefit from creating those habitats.
Lovely, thank you. Just mindful of the time. There was just one question that I thought might hopefully be quick to answer. Just in terms of legislation for Scotland and Wales, are you aware of any there? Is it similar to what it is here?
We hear very little about that. I think at the moment, there's nothing in place in Wales, and Scotland are looking to bring biodiversity net gain in, but they are, I think, watching and waiting to see what England are doing, and will and use that as a kind of guidance. But yeah, every conference you go to, every course, it's all England based. So I think it's a kind of watch this space with Wales and Scotland. Scotland, I've definitely heard are moving towards it. Wales, I haven't heard anything, so I'm not sure about that.
Okay, so hopefully they'll just copy it across and might be very similar then if they're using England kind of as a test there.
Yeah.
Lovely. I think we are pretty much running out of time now. Obviously still plenty more, but thanks everyone for watching. Thanks very much, Amy, for talking us through to biodiversity net gain today. And yeah, obviously keep an eye on all the other events that are booked in from CIWEM. Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.